Okay, let's unpack this. You might have heard the conversation around international students in Australia. Maybe debates about their numbers, concerns about, impact on cities, perhaps even linking them to things like housing costs. But what if the data, the actual information from the sources you've shared with us, tells a much bigger, far more essential story about their role, especially coming out of a massive economic shock?
What's fascinating here is exploring that precise tension, the difference between, say, public perception and the undeniable economic impact detailed in your material.
Exactly. This deep dive is all about uncovering that story. We're digging into the indispensable role international students played in Australia's economic recovery and keeping the labor market stable after COVID-19, drawing directly from the sources you provided.
And to understand that role, we really have to remember the backdrop. Your sources paint a clear picture of the challenge COVID presented. Australia's economy, well, it officially went into recession. We saw a record 7% drop in GDP in the June 2020 quarter.
7%, wow.
Yeah, which led to a 1.1% fall for the entire year.
A serious hit then. And as you'd expect, sectors that relied heavily on international movement, like education and tourism, were hit hardest by the border closures and restrictions.
Definitely. Government stimulus certainly helped soften the blow, which is important context, but the international education sector itself faced a profound crisis.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting, according to your sources. Despite that initial severe impact, its subsequent recovery wasn't just impressive. The data reveals it was absolutely central to the national rebound. In fact, it was instrumental in averting a deeper or, longer downturn.
And this isn't exactly a new phenomenon, is it? International education has a long history as a major economic contributor in Australia, going back decades.
Absolutely. Your sources highlight its significant growth, averaging around, 14% annually in volume terms from 1982 right up to 2007.
By 2007, it had already climbed to be Australia's third largest export. That's huge. It surpassed leisure travel services even then.
And this is a crucial point the sources emphasize. Nearly all of that value, about 97% back in 2007, came from students actually studying here, within Australia. That money wasn't just earned offshore, it was injected directly into the economy, spent in cities and towns, creating that vital economic activity.
Then came the shock of COVID. Your material details the dramatic decline. The sector's value roughly halved.
Halved.
Yeah, dropping from a peak of over $40 billion in 2019 to around $22.5 billion in 2021. That was a huge blow, particularly for universities, obviously.
A massive hit, yes. But then look at the rebound the data shows. It surged to over $29 billion in 2022.
And then rocketed up to $48 billion in 2023.
$48 billion.
That actually positioned it as the second biggest export that year, right behind mining.
Wow, second biggest. And it didn't stop there, did it? It hit an all-time peak of over $51 billion in the financial year 2023-24. That's just a stunning comeback.
It really is. Your sources do mention that its specific ranking second, third, or fourth can, vary slightly depending on how you measure it, calendar year versus financial year, and fluctuations in commodity prices. But the consistent message is its place among Australia's absolute top few export earners. Undeniably important.
And we zoom out to the national picture. This recovery wasn't just important for this sector, it was crucial for the whole country. Universities Australia, cited in your sources, has a truly striking data point. They state international education drove half of Australia's economic growth in 2023. Half, contributing 0.8 percentage points to the total 1.5% recovery.
Half of the national growth coming from this one sector's recovery. That's incredibly significant.
It is. And the sources go even further, stating that the sector almost single-handedly kept us out of recession in 2023.
That's powerful language.
It's powerful, direct language right from your material.
It really highlights how vital its rapid post-COVID return was to the overall Australian economic performance and resilience.
But the economic contribution isn't just about the big picture GDP numbers or, the tuition fees. Your sources break down how students actually spend their money, revealing a much wider ripple effect across the economy.
Yes, exactly. It's not just university fees. The majority of what international students spend goes into the broader economy on goods and services. Back in 2007, 61% was spent on things like food, accommodation, transport, entertainment. Even during the disruption of 2020, over half went to these areas.
And the latest figures really underscore this. In FY 2023-24, Over $30 billion came from their spending on goods and services, compared to about $20 billion on tuition fees.
$30 billion into goods and services.
That's a huge amount flowing directly into local businesses, cafes, shops.
Landlords, transport providers, this is where that multiplier effect really kicks in. When students buy groceries, pay rent, use public transport, or go out, that money circulates, stimulating activity far beyond just the education institutions.
Okay, let's unpack another absolutely critical piece the sources highlight. The integrated contribution of students as workers.
This is key. A significant portion of the student expenditure we just talked about, it's actually funded by their work right here in Australia.
Right. The ABS estimates, cited in your sources, that around a quarter of their total expenditure, that's roughly $13 billion in FY 2023-24, is funded through international students' local employment.
$13 billion. So this creates a really unique dynamic, doesn't it? Their participation in the labor market directly enhances their overall export value to the country. They're providing foreign income and contributing to the domestic workforce simultaneously. It's quite remarkable.
And that workforce contribution became absolutely essential after COVID, especially in what some sources term the odd job market, those crucial casual and part-time roles.
Oh, definitely. Australia faced really widespread and severe labor shortages coming out of the pandemic. Your sources note it was ranked as the second most severe in the developed world. Think about it. 85% of businesses surveyed couldn't operate at full capacity. This hit sectors like hospitality, retail, shopping malls particularly hard.
85%. And we're talking about national shortages across more than 330 occupations.
Yeah, including major areas like healthcare. There's a projected need for 250,000 skilled workers by 2027 and a shortage of, 70,000 nurses expected by 2035, plus huge gaps in skilled trades.
And this is where students stepped in.
International students played a vital and incredibly flexible role in helping to fill these gaps, especially in those casual and part-time positions. Your sources describe them as critical for support roles. Many were taking those lower-wage jobs that are nonetheless essential for industries to function smoothly.
And the government explicitly recognized this. The sources mentioned specific policy actions. Back in March 2020, work hour limits for students were temporarily lifted.
Right, in essential services.
Exactly. Aged care, supermarkets, precisely to address staff shortages in those areas. It was deliberate.
And post-COVID, government policies like visa rebates and efforts to clear backlogs were explicitly aimed at encouraging their return to address critical workforce shortages and boost the economy. That's the official language.
So this wasn't accidental. They were seen and maybe used as economic shock absorbers.
Pretty much. When the domestic workforce was disrupted by illness, isolation, or just the sudden demand surge, students provided that flexible, responsive pool of labor needed to help keep essential services and businesses running.
Industry bodies saw it too.
Absolutely. Retail associations like the ARA and NRA, cited in the sources, emphasized their indispensable role as both workers and consumers. They called students crucial for part-time and casual roles and key to solving the retail labor crisis, which at one point had over 25,600 national vacancies.
25,000 vacancies just in retail. Wow. And just to put it in perspective, the international education sector as a whole, through all these channels, supported about 250,000 Australian jobs in 2023.
250,000 jobs, that's more than double the combined employment in the mining sector, just for context.
So pulling it all together, we have this documented picture of an enormous economic engine, the top export driving national growth, and a crucial flexible workforce filling critical gaps needed for businesses to operate.
A really powerful combination.
Yet, despite these massive data-backed contributions, your sources highlight a really significant disconnect. The media narratives and often negative public perceptions international students frequently face.
And this contrast raises a really important question, doesn't it, about how the public conversation aligns, or maybe doesn't align, with these economic realities documented in the data.
One of the most common narratives widely reported in your sources is blaming international students for the housing crisis, suggesting they contribute significantly to rising costs and the rental crunch. We've even heard politicians, including the treasurer, according to the sources, make similar suggestions.
Yes, that narrative is definitely out there. However, the research presented in your sources offers a very different perspective. A UNISA study covering 7 years, from 2017 to 2024, found no statistical relationship between international student numbers and the housing crisis. It explicitly stated they are not the culprits and only a small part of a much larger problem.
And get this, the study found that when other factors are controlled for, an increase of 10,000 students actually corresponded with a $1 decrease in weekly rents.
A decrease, which directly challenges that common narrative.
It really has.
And data from the Student Accommodation Council, also cited, shows international students make up only about 6% of renters nationally. And nearly 40% of them live in student-specific housing, purpose-built stuff, so they're not even competing in the general rental market to the extent people might think. Your sources conclude the housing crisis is driven by very complicated macro-level socioeconomic reasons, not primarily student numbers.
It's important, as you say, to present these different findings neutrally, just reporting what's in the source material we have.
Exactly. And similarly, another narrative often seen in media and political rhetoric frames students as economic threats, implying they take jobs from domestic workers.
Right, the job competition argument.
And this stands in, well, sharp contrast to the reality we just discussed, the documented severe labor shortages across the country, especially in hospitality, retail, and aged care. Your sources show students are actually crucial for filling those documented gaps, not competing for jobs where there are already too few workers. Again, we're just laying out the different claims and the counter evidence found in your sources without taking a side.
Your sources also touch on other negative portrayals, don't they? Misrepresentations of English proficiency, blaming them for declining university standards, contributing to what's called discursive exclusion.
Yeah, essentially being talked about in ways that marginalize them, and a broader characterization that reduces them to being temporary, expendable, or invisible, sometimes seen as commodified, valued only for their fees, but then marginalized as the excluded other. Your source even mentioned direct experiences of racism, like being spat at or told to go back home. Really awful stuff.
And the impact of messaging here is significant, isn't it? The sources note how things like the Prime Minister suggesting students go home during the pandemic damaged Australia's reputation and affected students' sense of belonging. And policy changes, like increasing visa fees, can send contradictory messages about how valued they really are, despite their economic contributions.
Absolutely. And research cited from the ANU highlights just how powerful media narratives can be. They can often be more effective than facts in shaping public opinion. Negative immigration stories, specifically, have been shown to reduce public support for migration. This really underscores the critical need for impartial reporting and, looking at the underlying data.
It really does. And your sources do mention efforts to counter these dominant narratives. We see studies refuting the housing blame, industry bodies like Universities Australia highlighting the massive economic contributions, GDP, jobs, and so on.
And importantly, students themselves are using platforms the film Phoenix has mentioned to share their lived experiences and challenge those often flat, negative portrayals. They're advocating for recognition not just as economic units, but as equals, colleagues, neighbors, vital members of the community.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener? Why have we gone through all this detail?
Well, understanding this deep dive is valuable because it equips you to cut through that noise, the conflicting information and common misconceptions about a really major economic and social group in Australia.
It gives you a fact-based understanding of how different parts of the economy are genuinely interconnected, how migration plays a significant role.
And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates how looking at the data can fundamentally challenge widespread narratives often amplified in public discourse. It encourages a more informed, nuanced perspective beyond simple blame or credit, rooted in the evidence from the sources you've explored.
Okay, so to wrap up this deep dive, based on your sources, the evidence seems pretty clear. International students are an absolute powerhouse for the Australian economy. They function as a massive export industry, injecting billions through tuition and widespread spending on goods and services, creating a huge multiplier effect across diverse local businesses.
And critically, they were a crucial, flexible labor force, acting as vital shock absorbers during periods of severe labor shortages post-COVID. Their role in filling critical gaps in sectors like hospitality, retail, and healthcare was essential for keeping the economy functioning and supporting hundreds of thousands of Australian jobs.
The striking contrast, as your sources repeatedly highlight, is between these massive data-backed economic realities and the prevalent, often negative public and media narratives that frequently misrepresent their role. They are often scapegoated for issues like housing or job competition, despite the documented data showing their positive contributions and the complex, multifaceted nature of those problems.
Yeah, and your sources conclude that aligning policy and public discourse with these economic realities isn't just about fairness, it's vital for building a more stable, resilient, and inclusive Australian economy. And frankly, for maintaining Australia's global competitiveness as an attractive study destination.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder, pulling from everything we've discussed today. Given this documented gap between the hard economic data on international students' contributions and the public narrative surrounding them, how can we, as individuals consuming information, better equip ourselves to evaluate complex issues like migration and the economy? How do we ensure we are informed by evidence and multiple perspectives rather than being easily swayed by potentially misleading or emotionally charged portrayals? Something to think about.